I've worked as a psychiatric nurse for almost 5 years now. Most people think this job would be terrifying, but honestly, I've grown to love my patients, even the ones who others find difficult. When you spend enough time with people, you start to see past their diagnosis, past their symptoms. You see who they really are beneath it all. My hospital is an older building with long hallways and rooms that can feel too quiet at night. The night shift is particularly demanding: fewer staff, more responsibility, and that peculiar stillness that only exists between midnight and dawn. The psychiatric ward was my preferred assignment. I'd developed a rapport with most of the long-term patients, and they trusted me. Trust is everything in psychiatry. One patient in particular, Marcus, had been with us for nearly 3 months. He suffered from severe schizophrenia, but his medication had been working well. His delusions had subsided, and he was making genuine progress. Marcus and I would often talk during my night shifts. He was incredibly intelligent before his illness took hold. He'd been studying quantum physics at the university. He'd explained theories to me that went way over my head, but I enjoyed listening. 2 weeks ago, something changed. Marcus started becoming agitated during the nights. He'd pace his room, staring into the corners, whispering to someone who wasn't there. "He's back," Marcus told me one night, his voice barely audible. "The man in the white coat stands by my bed and watches me sleep. He's been coming more frequently now." I reassured him it was likely a symptom of his condition. Perhaps his medication needed adjustment. We'd look into it in the morning. Standard procedure. But then, Marcus said something that froze the blood in my veins. "He's not here for me, Thomas. He's here for room 307. Room 307 was where we had just moved Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly woman with advanced dementia. She'd only been with us for 4 days. I didn't think much of it. Patients sometimes fixate on random details. I made a note in Marcus's chart and continued my rounds. The next morning, Mrs. Abernathy was found unresponsive. Despite our best efforts, she passed away heart failure, the doctor said. Nothing suspicious, just an elderly patient with multiple health conditions. That night, Marcus was calmer. When I asked about the man in the white coat, he simply said he got what he came for. He won't be back for a while. A chill ran down my spine, but I dismissed it. Coincidences happen all the time in hospitals. People die, it's inevitable. Then, 3 nights later, Marcus became agitated again. I found him pressed against the wall of his room, eyes wide with fear. "He's back, Thomas. Room 316 this time. He's standing there right now. Can't you see him?" By the window. Room 316 housed Mr. Collins, a middle-aged man recovering from a psychotic episode brought on by excessive medication. He was scheduled to be discharged in a few days. I looked where Marcus was pointing. The hallway was empty, just the usual shadows cast by the nightlights. "There's no one there, Marcus," I said gently, placing my hand on his shoulder. "Let's get you back to bed." He grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "He knows you can't see him, but you will. They always do, eventually." I gave Marcus his medication and waited until he fell asleep. Then I walked past room 316 just to check. Mr. Collins was sleeping peacefully. 4 hours later, Mr. Collins went into cardiac arrest. Despite the emergency team's efforts, he didn't make it. 2 predictions, 2 deaths. My rational mind struggled to explain it away. Psychiatric patients sometimes have heightened intuition about their environments. Marcus might have noticed subtle changes in the patient's conditions that even we medical professionals missed. But deep down, I knew there was something more happening. Last week, I was alone at the nurse's station around 3 a.m., that dead time when the hospital feels suspended between worlds. The monitors hummed softly, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The security camera feed showed empty hallways. All patients were accounted for and sleeping. Then Marcus's call button lit up. I sighed, grabbed my flashlight, and made my way to his room. He was sitting upright in bed, pointing to the corner of his room. "He's here again," he whispered, but this time he swallowed hard. "He's looking at you, Thomas." I felt the hair on my arm stand up. "What do you mean?" "He knows you're noticing the pattern. He doesn't like that." Marcus's eyes never left the empty corner. "He says you should transfer to the day shift." I'll admit it, I was spooked. But I've dealt with threatening statements before. Part of the job. "Can you describe him to me, Marcus?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tall, thin, white coat, but not like yours, older, like from another time." His face, Marcus shuddered. "His face isn't right. Too long. Eyes too dark." I made a note to speak with his psychiatrist about adjusting his medication again. As I turned to leave, Marcus grabbed my arm. "He's following you now, Thomas. He'll be in the supply closet at the end of the hall." I nodded, humoring him, and continued my rounds. The rational part of me knew there was nothing to fear, just the delusions of a schizophrenic patient. But as I passed the supply closet, I heard a soft rustling sound from inside. Probably just the ventilation system. I hesitated, then reached for the door handle. Professional curiosity, I told myself. The closet was dark. I fumbled for the light switch, found it, flicked it on. Empty shelves greeted me. Medical supplies, cleaning products, linens. Nothing unusual. Until I noticed the mirror on the back wall standard issue for staff to check their appearance before returning to the floor. In the reflection, I saw myself, and behind me, just over my left shoulder, a tall figure in an antiquated white coat. I spun around, heart pounding, nothing there. Just me and the medical supplies. When I turned back to the mirror, the reflection showed only me again. My imagination was clearly working overtime. I closed the supply closet and continued my rounds, feeling foolish for being so affected by Marcus's suggestion. That's when I heard a whisper right beside my ear. "Room 329. I whirled around. The hallway was empty, but my skin crawled with goosebumps, and the air felt suddenly cold. Room 329 housed Janet Miller, a young woman admitted for severe depression following a suicide attempt. She'd been improving steadily. I practically ran to her room, my heart hammering against my ribs. She was sleeping peacefully, her vital signs normal on the monitor. I stood watching her for several minutes, reassuring myself. Everything was fine. I was letting Marcus's delusions get to me. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a white coat disappearing around the corner at the end of the hallway. "I've requested a transfer to the day shift." My supervisor was understanding. "Night work isn't for everyone," she said. I haven't told anyone what happened next. How I found Marcus the following morning, awake and completely lucid for the first time in months. "He won't bother you anymore," Marcus told me, his eyes clear. "I made a deal with him." "What kind of deal?" I asked, dreading the answer. Marcus just smiled. "Some doors should stay closed, Thomas. Some visitors should be left to their rounds." 3 days later, Janet Miller in room 329 made a miraculous recovery. Her depression lifted like magic. She said, "The doctors were baffled, but pleased. I start my day shifts next week. Marcus will be discharged soon, his schizophrenia suddenly in complete remission. Last night was my final night shift. As I was leaving, Marcus called out to me. He's still here, you know," he said quietly. "But he respects the arrangement. Just don't look for him in the mirrors anymore." I didn't ask what he meant. Some questions are better left unanswered. But sometimes, when I pass the long mirrors in the hospital hallways, I keep my eyes straight ahead. I don't look at the reflections anymore, and I never, ever enter the supply closet alone. I've been a patient at Mahdi Medical Institute for nearly 7 years now. Most people dread hospital visits, but when you have a chronic condition like mine, you learn to make peace with the endless appointments. My neurological symptoms started gradually slight tremors in my hands, occasional headaches that would last for days. Nothing that seemed too alarming at first. After multiple tests and referrals, I ended up under the care of Dr. Richardson, head of neurology, a well-respected figure within the hospital, his office walls lined with credentials, awards, and photographs with medical luminaries. At 50 years old, I'd grown accustomed to doctors speaking about me rather than to me. But Dr. Richardson was different. He looked me in the eyes when we spoke, remembered details about my life between visits. The nurses called me a frequent flyer, not unkindly. After dozens of appointments over the years, many staff knew me by name. The familiarity was comforting in an environment that could otherwise feel cold and clinical. Dr. Richardson ran additional tests that previous doctors hadn't considered. My diagnosis finally made sense, a rare form of progressive neuropathy. He prescribed a treatment plan that actually improved my symptoms for the first time in years. I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? He'd given me hope when others had offered only maintenance care. He'd treated me with dignity when others saw just another case number. The shift happened so gradually I barely noticed it. Dr. Richardson began suggesting experimental treatments, nothing too unusual for a complex case like mine. He'd spend extra time during our appointments, often running late for his next patient. "You're a fascinating case study," he'd say, his pen tapping rhythmically against his clipboard. "Your response to treatment is quite extraordinary." I took it as a compliment at the time. I didn't notice how his eyes seemed to light up when discussing my symptoms rather than my recovery. About 6 months ago, my condition began deteriorating despite the treatment. Dr. Richardson didn't seem concerned, in fact. He seemed almost pleased to document the progression. "We'll need to see you more frequently," he said, writing rapidly in my file. "Twice weekly should give us better data." Data, not relief, not treatment data. Something cold crept into his voice that day, but I dismissed it. He was the expert, after all. During one appointment, I noticed a research paper on his desk with my patient number prominently displayed. When I asked about it, he smoothly slid it into a folder. "Just some notes," he said, smiling that reassuring smile that had always comforted me before. "Nothing to worry about." But there was something in his eyes, a calculation, an assessment that made me uneasy for the first time. I left with a prescription for a new medication and an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't shake. That night, I experienced the worst side effects I'd ever had: violent tremors, blinding headaches, momentary lapses in consciousness. The on-call doctor seemed confused by my symptoms and my medication list. "Who authorized this combination?" she asked, her brow furrowed as she reviewed my chart. This isn't standard protocol for your condition. When I returned from my next appointment, I mentioned the side effects to Dr. Richardson. Instead of concern, he seemed fascinated, pulling out a voice recorder. Can you describe the exact sensation of the tremors? Were they localized or general? What about the headache? Was it similar to your previous ones or different in quality? No questions about my comfort, my fear, my pain. Just clinical curiosity about my suffering. I began researching my medication that evening, something I should have done months earlier. What I discovered sent ice through my veins. The combination I'd been prescribed wasn't approved for my condition. In fact, several of the medications weren't indicated for neuropathy at all. They were used in experimental treatments for entirely different disorders. My next discovery was worse. Dr. Richardson was leading a research study on experimental treatments for neurological disorders. My specific combination of symptoms made me an ideal test subject, but there was no consent form in my file for any research study. I was a lab rat, not a patient, a subject. The hospital corridors felt different during my next visit, threatening rather than familiar. The same nurses who'd greeted me warmly for years now seemed like potential conspirators. How many of them knew? I requested copies of my complete medical records, my legal right as a patient. The clerk at the records desk gave me an odd look but processed my request. 3 days later, I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing years of medical notes. Most seemed standard, but Dr. Richardson's notes were different coded observations about my responses to various protocols. References to Subject 37, discussions of promising adverse reactions. My hands shook as I read, not from my condition, but from growing horror. He'd been adjusting my medications not to help me improve, but to document how my body would respond to various combinations. My deterioration wasn't a failure of treatment, it was the treatment working as he intended. I brought the records to another neurologist at General Hospital. Her face grew increasingly grave as she reviewed them. "This isn't treatment," she said finally, looking up at me. "This is unethical experimentation. Without consent, without oversight." We filed a formal complaint with the medical board that week. The investigation revealed 7 other patients, all with rare or complex neurological conditions, all under Dr. Richardson's exclusive care, all getting progressively worse despite being treated by one of Boston's most respected neurologists. The hospital administration claimed no knowledge of his unauthorized research. His colleagues expressed shock and dismay. He was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. That was 2 months ago. My new treatment plan under a different doctor has already reversed some of the damage. My tremors have decreased. The headaches are less frequent. But something else has changed. I question everything now. Every pill, every test, every recommendation. I research everything my doctors tell me. I record our conversations. I trust no one completely. Last week, I saw Dr. Richardson in the hospital parking garage. He was carrying boxes to his car, personal items from his office. Our eyes met across the concrete expanse. He didn't look away. He didn't look ashamed or angry or defensive. He smiled that same reassuring smile that had once made me feel so safe, so cared for. "Subject 37, he said, nodding as if we were colleagues. "Your case will be my legacy. The data is remarkable." I stood frozen as he closed his trunk and walked around to the driver's side. Before getting in, he paused and looked back at me. "You should know the long-term effects of those medication combinations haven't been documented yet. You might want to have your liver function tested monthly." For the next few years, he drove away, leaving me standing there, still his subject, still his experiment, still generating data for him, even after everything. The medical board revoked his license last month. The hospital settled privately with most of his patients. There are criminal charges pending, but I still see him sometimes in my nightmares, in the face of every doctor who examines me. I hear his clinical voice noting my symptoms with detached fascination. The worst monster isn't the one who hates you. It's the one who doesn't see you as human at all. Just an interesting collection of symptoms. A promising source of data. Just Subject 37, responding remarkably well to protocol. The fluorescent lights of Woodland Hospital's emergency entrance burned my eyes as I carried my 16-year-old son through the sliding doors. My wife, Rachel, ran alongside us, her face streaked with tears, repeatedly whispering, "Please be okay," like a desperate prayer. This wasn't how our camping trip was supposed to end, with our son, Ethan, unconscious, his body broken after falling from a steep trail onto rocks below. The wilderness first responders had done what they could before the helicopter arrived. Blood soaked through the temporary bandages wrapped around Ethan's head. His breathing was shallow, his skin ashen against the bright red that seemed to be everywhere. On his clothes, on my hands, on Rachel's jacket. The trauma team swarmed around us immediately. A blur of scrubs and urgent voices. They took him from my arms, the hardest thing I've ever had to do, and rushed him through doors where we couldn't follow. "Sir, ma'am, I need you to stay here and give us some information," a nurse said, firmly, clipboard in hand. Her name tag read Gloria. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from too many tragedies witnessed. We answered her questions mechanically. Ethan's age, medical history, blood type, the details of the fall. My hands trembled as I filled out forms that seemed meaningless, while my son fought for his life somewhere beyond those sealed doors. 3 hours passed in the waiting room, the longest of my life. Rachel clutched my hand, her wedding ring digging into my palm. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? Finally, a surgeon appeared, Dr. Whitaker, according to his ID badge. His surgical mask hung around his neck, and I tried not to notice the blood on his gown. "Ethan's blood. Your son has suffered significant trauma. Cranial bleeding, internal injuries, a ruptured spleen. We've stabilized him for now, but he's going to need multiple surgeries." Rachel swayed slightly beside me. I put my arm around her shoulders to steady her, to steady myself. "Can we see him?" Her voice sounded nothing like my wife's, thin, brittle, foreign. Briefly, "He's being prepared for additional surgery." Dr. Whitaker's pager beeped. He checked it, his expression shifting slightly. "I need to take this. Nurse Gloria will take you to him." Something in his manner struck me as off, the way his eyes didn't quite meet ours, how he seemed almost eager to leave us. But I dismissed it as the stress of the moment. Gloria led us through a labyrinth of corridors to the ICU. The antiseptic smell burned my nostrils as we approached a glass-walled room where our son lay surrounded by machines. Ethan looked impossibly small among the tubes and wires. His head was partially bandaged, his face swollen and discolored. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only reassurance he was still with us. Rachel broke down at the sight of him. I held her up as best I could while fighting my own wave of nausea and grief. 2 minutes, Gloria said, her tone softening slightly. "Talk to him." They can sometimes hear even when unconscious. We each held one of his hands, careful to avoid disturbing the IV lines. Rachel whispered how much she loved him, how strong he was, how he needed to fight. I could barely speak at all. A different doctor entered, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and economical movements. "I'm Dr. Lorenz, head of transplant surgery. I need to discuss something important with you both." "Transplant surgery?" My confusion must have shown on my face. "Given the severity of your son's injuries, we need to discuss organ donation contingencies," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "Time is essential in these cases." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. "He's still alive," I said, my voice rising. "What are you talking about?" "It's standard procedure in catastrophic cases to have this discussion early," Dr. Lorenz explained. "Your son's injuries are extensive. We want to be prepared for all outcomes." Rachel made a sound like a wounded animal. "No," she said. "No, no, no. He's going to be fine. He has to be." Dr. Lorenz's eyes flickered to Gloria, who stepped forward. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in private. Mrs. Carter, would you come with me? We have some additional forms for you to review." Before I could object, Gloria was guiding my distraught wife from the room. Dr. Lorenz turned to me, her demeanor shifting subtly. "Mr. Carter, I understand this is difficult, but your son is an ideal candidate. Young, healthy organs. Many lives could be saved." Something cold settled in my stomach. "Candidate? He hasn't even had his surgeries yet. You're talking about him like he's already gone." She checked her watch. "The trauma surgeon gave you the prognosis, correct? Less than 10% chance of meaningful recovery. The kindest thing now is to think of others who could benefit." "Dr. Whitaker never said anything about percentages," I said slowly, alarm bells ringing in my head. "He said Ethan needed more surgery." Dr. Lorenz's expression flickered briefly. "I see. Well, the situation is grave nonetheless. If you'll excuse me, I need to check on another patient. Please consider what I've said." As she left, I noticed her stop at the nurse's station, speaking urgently to a man in a suit, not medical scrubs. He glanced my way, then picked up a phone. Something was very wrong here. I'd worked as a medical equipment technician for 15 years. I'd been in dozens of hospitals, seen countless trauma cases. This felt off-rushed, coordinated, predatory. I slipped out to find Rachel. Instead of the waiting room, Gloria had taken her to a small office at the end of the corridor. Through the window in the door, I could see my wife signing papers, tears streaming down her face. I pushed through the door. "Rachel, stop. Don't sign anything else." Gloria stepped between us. "Sir, please. Your wife is making some preliminary arrangements just in case. It's important to be prepared." I took the papers from Rachel's hands, scanning them quickly. My blood ran cold. "This isn't a preliminary arrangement. This is consent for organ harvesting. You're having her sign this while she's in shock." Rachel looked up at me in horror. "They said it was standard paperwork, just admissions forms. They said Ethan wasn't going to make it, and we needed to be realistic. My years in hospitals had taught me one critical thing: processes have protocols, and this wasn't it. No ethical transplant coordinator approaches families hours after admission, especially without comprehensive neurological testing. "We're getting a second opinion," I announced, helping Rachel to her feet. "And we're staying with our son." Gloria's pleasant demeanor vanished. That's not advisable. Your son needs immediate specialized care that only our team can provide. Then provide it, I said firmly. But we're not discussing organ donation until all treatment options have been exhausted. When we returned to Ethan's room, we found orderlies preparing to move him. A tag on his bed read OR4. "What's happening?" I demanded. Dr. Whitaker said he'd come back before the next surgery. The orderly looked uncomfortable. "Orders from Dr. Lorenz. Patients being prepped for surgery now." I placed myself between them and my son's bed. Not without Dr. Whitaker's confirmation. And not without telling us what surgery they're performing. I pulled out my phone and called 911 from inside the hospital. The orderlies exchanged glances, clearly confused by this unprecedented move. "I need to report an attempted medical battery," I told the dispatcher. "Woodland Hospital, ICU room 12. They're attempting unauthorized surgery on my minor son." Hospital security arrived before the police summoned by Gloria, no doubt. But the 911 call had created exactly what I needed: external documentation and witnesses. "What seems to be the problem?" asked the security guard, a former police officer by his bearing. "These people are attempting to take my son to surgery without proper consent or explanation," I said calmly. "And the transplant team is pressuring my wife to sign organ donation forms while our son is still alive and hasn't received full treatment." The guard frowned, clearly not expecting this situation. "Ma'am?" he asked Rachel. She nodded, still clutching the forms I'd taken from her. "They told me he was brain dead, but my husband says he hasn't even had the tests for that." The security guard's radio crackled. The police had arrived at the emergency entrance. Things were about to get very official, exactly what Dr. Lorenz and her team didn't want. Within 20 minutes, hospital administration had become involved. The police took statements. Most importantly, Dr. Whitaker returned genuinely surprised to find his patient being prepped for a surgery he hadn't ordered. "Ethan needs cranial surgery to relieve pressure, and we need to repair his spleen," he confirmed, reviewing the chart with growing confusion. "But he's nowhere near brain death criteria." "Who ordered these tests?" He pointed to a form requesting organ compatibility screening. The next 24 hours revealed a nightmare hiding within the hospital's respected walls. An internal investigation uncovered what police would later call a coordinated organ harvesting operation involving certain members of the transplant team. Dr. Lorenz had been artificially elevating mortality predictions for specific patients, young, healthy individuals with rare blood types, or ideal tissue matches for private clients on unofficial waiting lists. Wealthy clients who paid enormous sums to bypass the National Organ Registry system. They didn't kill patients outright too suspicious. Instead, they identified vulnerable cases and created conditions where death became more likely while securing early consent for organ harvesting. Sometimes, as with Ethan, they attempted to fast-track the process before adequate treatment was provided. 3 months have passed since that night. Ethan is home now, healing slowly but surely. The right side of his body is weaker than before, and he struggles sometimes with finding words. But his neurosurgeon is optimistic about his recovery. Dr. Lorenz and 7 others face multiple criminal charges. The hospital has implemented new protocols requiring multiple physician sign-offs for any organ donation discussions. Gloria lost her nursing license. Rachel still has nightmares about signing those papers about what might have happened if I hadn't worked in hospitals, if I hadn't recognized the wrongness of their approach. Sometimes I walk past Ethan's room at night, just to hear him breathing, to reassure myself that he's still here, that we didn't lose him to people who saw him not as a 16-year-old boy with his whole life ahead of him, but as a collection of valuable parts to be harvested. I've testified twice now for the prosecution. Each time, Dr. Lorenz sits at the defense table, her expression unchanged, clinical, detached, calculating. She doesn't look like a monster. She looks like any doctor you might trust with your life, or the life of someone you love. That's the most terrifying part of all.
Subscribe to our channel for more scary stories. We would love to read your comments. Which story did you like